Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Only Stupid Answers. So, for this week, I thought it would be good to talk about Amalgam Comics because for the first time in a long time, Marvel and DC have decided to reprint a bunch of their crossovers into two large hardcover volumes. One will be all the Marvel and DC crossovers throughout the ages, and one of them will be Amalgam. And I, being a 90s kid, born in the 80s, but most of my formative memories are in the 90s, I have a fondness in my heart for Amalgam. And so I'm very excited about these reprints, even though I own every Amalgam comic. I'm still getting the collection, even though I own the individual issues. Roxy, are you familiar with Amalgam at all?
When you say that they're going to be doing all of the Marvel and DC reprints and the Amalgam,
Yeah.
that's what makes me feel like I'm less familiar than I might have thought.
Gotcha. Well, this is...
I thought that was Marvel and DC merger that you're talking about. They're reprinting.
It is, but there's a little bit of backstory to it, and if you weren't around at the time, it's a little bit convoluted, like a lot of '90s comics are. So that's what we're going to get into. But before we get to Amalgam, I have to talk about DC versus Marvel because that's how we get to Amalgam. So that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Is in 1996, DC and Marvel teamed up to do a 4-issue intercompany crossover event, and it was published between February and May of that year. And so 2 of the issues were DC versus Marvel, 2 of the issues were Marvel versus DC. Marvel contributed a writer and artist, and DC contributed a writer and artist. DC's were Ron Mars and Dan Jurgens, and Marvel provided Peter David and Claudio Castellini. And again, for my 90s kid heart, Ron Mars is the co-creator of Kyle Rayner, who's not only my favorite Green Lantern, but possibly one of my favorite DC characters of all time. And Dan Jurgens was working on Sensational Spider-Man when Ben Reilly was Spider-Man. And so I think he's the one that created the Ben Reilly Spider-Man costume, which is my favorite Spider-Man costume.
Which is stuff you know in hindsight, DJ, or in 96, things you were aware of?
No idea. No clue. So I'm like 10 years old when this is coming out. Yeah. So for me, it's just like, oh, no snap. Hulk and Spider-Man are fighting, Superman and Batman. Oh, my God. That's all I know about. I don't know about creative. Like, I didn't even, I'm not even, I think they did a good job pairing artists together. But, different artists are tackling different segments. I couldn't even tell you when the switch happens when I'm reading it.
When was Kyle Rayner even created?
Early 90s, so it was right before Earlier than this, yeah. And that's another thing. If you go back and revisit DC versus Marvel, it is very of its time. So they paired off a bunch of characters, and I'm going to give you a list, but and they paired off characters for similar theming or whatever. And Connor Kent's Superboy was paired off with Spider-Man, which if you live in the now times, you're like, why? Why that?
Yeah, just based off of their skill sets, their age, their jovialness, I totally get it, but that's wild.
Yeah, but 96, the reason was because they were both clones. Connor Kent's a clone of Clark Kent. At this time, Ben Reilly Spider-Man, not Peter Parker, and he's a clone. So basically, they were like, clones, these two fight.
That's crazy too, because you just know one of those became like the biggest character ever.
Yeah.
And the other, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So but the reason we're here is because in 1996, listen, gang, comics are always struggling. All right. There's never a spot in the history of comics where they're like, oh, maybe like right after the introduction of Superman and Batman and Shazam and all that in the early 30s and 40s. But for most modern history of comics are always struggling. But in 96, it was a particularly hard time, specifically for Marvel, because at this point, Marvel is at the end of this year, 1996, Marvel's going to file for bankruptcy. For this discussion, I pulled a lot from a Games Radar article published in 2021. That's talking about 1996 in comics generally. It was a wild year for comics. Onslaught was that year. I believe that was the year Superman got married. I'll link the article in the description or a comment or whatever. I recommend reading it because I didn't know so many things that are like seared into my memory from early, because I'm just picking up comics at thrift stores and stuff like that. I didn't know so many of that stuff happened in the same year, all in 1996. But sales are declining, except X-Men. The only books that are doing great in 96 are X-Men books. There's like a billion of them and they're all selling like hotcakes. If you're not X-Men, you're struggling to hit the top charts. Retailers are struggling. So, Rox, are you familiar with the speculator boom in comics?
No.
Okay, so in the 90s, there was a big push. This was right at the time where if you had a Action Comics #1 or an Amazing Fantasy 15, first appearance of a character, you could pay off the mortgage of your house with how much that comic would be worth. And so comics retailers leaned into this and publishers leaned into this by doing a bunch of new #1s, introducing a bunch of new characters, doing a bunch of different variants and saying like, hey, this comic, this X-Men #1 might be worth $1 billion in the future. You don't know. You should buy it. And so speculators would buy like a bunch of different copies of a comic under the hopes that it would be valuable someday, not realizing that the reason Action Comics #1 was so valuable is because they were meant to be thrown away. So very few of them lasted. So it was supply and demand. You know what I mean? High demand, small supply equals a lot of money. So like X-Men, Jim Lee's X-Men 1 is, I think to this day, still the highest selling comic of all time. It's not all that valuable. Everybody's got a copy. I'm sure if you dug around in the building you live in right now, you would just find one. You'd be like, how did it get here? They're everywhere.
That's funny.
So anyway, eventually that goosed comic book numbers for a long time, but like all bubbles, it burst. And so by 1996, that bubble had burst. A lot of Marvel's top creators had moved on to create Image Comics for the first time. Marvel was struggling. So in 96, Marvel's president at the time, Terry Stewart, called DC's publisher, Paul Levitz, which is just, again, like living now, it's wild that like Marvel was struggling so much that they called DC and was like, hey, you want to do a crossover? You want to, let's see if we can goose the numbers a little bit. Yeah. And that's where this came from. And the story itself is typical 90s nonsense. Basically, they're these two cosmic brothers. You can see here, one's red and one's blue, and they are the embodiment of their respective universes. One's Marvel, one's DC. And because they become aware of each other or something, they decide to fight. And it's decided that instead of them fighting, their greatest champions should fight. Whatever. It doesn't matter. It's all an excuse to get your favorite Marvel characters to fight your favorite DC characters.
Were the cosmic, the red and the blue, did they speak? Do they have...
You know what? I don't think they do speak. It's been a minute since I've read it. I don't think they do. They are spoken for. Like, people are aware of them. Become aware of them as people start like crossing over to the other worlds, and you get some fun stuff. There's 11 main battles, but you do get some other like stopping with some other characters as they like randomly cross over in each other's world. I can tell you, as a kid, it was the coolest thing ever. It was so cool. Especially, this isn't the first time Marvel and DC have crossed over. That was back, was it the 60s? It was Superman meets the Amazing Spider-Man. So they've been doing sporadic crossovers before this. But again, I was 10 at the time. I wasn't aware of all that. All that was published before my time. This is the first time I'm seeing any of these characters meet each other and interact with each other. And there was 11 battles total. 6 of them were determined by, the outcome was determined by the creative team. 5 of them were by fan votes. There was a way that you could vote who you wanted to win.
What was that way?
So, you know what? I don't. This is just the biggest, the faintest murmur of the internet at this point. I think this was where like AOL was sending, like mailing discs to people's houses. So I think it was write-in. I want to say, and comics have a long history of having letters in the back. Hold on. I can edit this out. I'll pull one of my copies. We'll see. This all is great for the audio listeners. So I just pulled really my copy of Marvel, DC versus Marvel #1. This is what I bought in the 90s. I was telling the chat that I'd like to think these have value, but
this actual one you held on to since then?
Yep. Wow. Yep. Okay. All right. So here in the back, we have our voting things. The battle. Who's stronger? Who's cooler? Who's meaner? Who's smarter? Who's tougher? Vote now. Yeah. So there's a little tab here at the bottom. You fill it out. You cut it off, and you mail it in. There's no online. Yeah, this is well before Wait. Oh no, you can't. You can email votes to the
Oh,
America
whoa.
Online ballot boxes of your 5 heroes, and you have to email. So like, if you wanted to vote Batman, it was you email it to dvmbatman@aol.com.
Oh, different email addresses for different people. Wow,
Yeah.
that seems like such a complicated
Yep.
system.
Yep. So that was how you voted. Here's the ones. Here are the 6 that were not vote that the creative team determined. Aquaman versus Namor. Aquaman won that one. He dropped a killer whale onto Namor. um,
That's amazing.
Yeah. And again, I have to remind everybody here when you're like, why that character? It was the 90s. So Elektra.
Namor making a comeback.
Yeah. Elektra versus Catwoman. And Elektra won that because the 90s.
The image you just showed, that was Elektra in the bottom right?
Yeah. Elektra in the red versus Catwoman.
I was like, who is that?
That's Elektra. That's Elektra.
Wow.
That's 90s Elektra versus 90s Catwoman. And weirdly, Elektra won that one.
That's what Elektra looked like. Whoa.
Yeah. So Flash versus Quicksilver. Flash won that one because of course he did. He runs so fast that he can rewrite time. Quicksilver's fast. He's not that fast.
It's less fun to see Flash versus Quicksilver and would be more fun to see like people with different skill sets, you know.
Well, you're going to get a little bit of that, but
Okay.
the main thing was it's so kind of haphazard because this next one is like teens, I guess. So it was Robin versus Jubilee, and the Robin was the Tim Drake Robin. And what made this fight complicated was Robin and Jubilee start like making romantic eyes at each other during this crossover. So they're having feelings for each other, and then they have to fight. Oh no. Robin won that fight, by the way, which again, it's like, of course he did. Next was Silver Surfer versus Green Lantern. This is Kyle Rayner's Green Lantern. And much to my fanboy heart's dismay, Silver Surfer won that one. And then Thor. Oh, do I have an image of Thor? Yeah, see, that's the 90s Thor, Roxy. With his abs out and everything. Let's bring that costume back, gang. It was Thor versus Shazam.
I love a crop top on Thor.
Yeah. He's pure himbo mode in this crossover, or at least for this costume. Yeah, it was him versus Captain Marvel for newer audiences. Shazam, he was called Captain Marvel at the time, and Thor won that one because he gets Billy Batson to turn back into a kid. Okay, so here are the 5 fan voted ones, and so I will have you guess these ones, Roxy, to see. Don't look at the doc I sent you. Don't look.
Okay.
See who you think the fans voted for.
So the fans voted for the winner?
For the winner of these next 5 competitions. Superman versus Hulk.
Superman.
Yeah, they did vote for Superman. And this is another one of those, which is a weird.
Oh, that's cool looking.
Yeah, it was cool. Like it's very 90s cool, but it's very cool.
Hulk looks like a watermelon with too many rubber bands tied on him here.
And this is Smart Hulk. He's full like Smart Hulk at this stage in the 90s. Next is, I told you before, Spider-Man versus Superboy.
I think they voted for Spider-Man.
Yeah, of course they did. It doesn't matter that it was Ben Reilly's Spider-Man. It's still Spider-Man.
Yeah,
of course they did. Batman versus Captain America. This one's even as a kid in the 90s, I'm like, well, this is a stretch. Batman. How do Batman and Captain America connect in any meaningful way?
I think that they voted for Batman, but I think Captain America would low-key beat the crap out of Batman. But I guess that's kind of what Batman versus Superman was. Anyway, Batman.
Oh yeah, 100% Batman. Batman and Superman were the only locks on this one for DC side. Next is again 90s. Everybody, Wolverine versus Lobo.
Oh, they voted for Wolverine.
Yeah, I have a quote here because it turns out they did the full art for either way, either direction the vote would go. And so I have a quote here from Dan Jurgens, who drew the Wolverine versus Lobo sequence. He said, "We knew going in that fans were going to vote, and I think we were willing to concede that Wolverine was likely going to win that, but we did 2 versions of each battle. As soon as it was clear who was going to win the fan vote, bam, we'd put in the correct finish art," which is crazy. And I
want to see what it looked like for Lobo to win.
Yeah, exactly. This fight in particular was funny because I think both of them were like 90s cool characters. Both of them had healing factors. I will say Lobo is strong enough to go toe-to-toe with Superman. So he's a little overpowered for Wolverine. But due to the nature of the 2 characters, most of this fight happens like off panel because of how violent they are. Like I think Wolverine like kills Lobo like behind a bar. Like you don't see it happen.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And this one was crazy to me as a kid as well. So this is the final one: Storm versus Wonder Woman. Roxy, who do you think the fans voted for in the '90s? I should note.
I still think they voted for Wonder
They
Woman.
didn't. They voted
They
for
voted for
Storm.
Storm?
And I should also note this fight begins with Wonder Woman wielding Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, and she's like, "This isn't fair," so she gets rid of it. And then Storm wins. And even as a kid, I was like, I still
The
think
way you
Wonder
said
Woman
in the
would
'90s,
win.
I was like, I think he's trying to tell me it's Storm, but I'm not willing to say that.
Yeah, it's like
That doesn't make it. That one makes the least sense
I
of any
know.
of them to
I
me.
love Storm. She's
Yeah, I like
great.
Storm a lot too.
She's very powerful. I still think Wonder Woman would win.
Wonder Woman, I still think would beat Superman. So you can't be pairing Wonder Woman with Storm and expecting me to. Okay.
So the outcome of this, for those keeping doing the math, is Marvel technically won. They had more in the win column. It's the '90s; their characters were really popular. Even though the studio was floundering, the characters were still popular. But that didn't matter, and we're gonna get story wise, and we're gonna get to why in a second. But I do a lot of things came out of this. One of them is Amalgam Comics, which we're gonna be talking about.
So none of this was Amalgam.
None of this, all this led to Amalgam. And at the end of issue 3, the fights have happened. But to say, instead of one of the, this is all to like, if whoever loses is supposed to vanish from existence. To prevent this from happening, the Living Tribunal and the Spectre like join forces, and they introduced this series introduced a character that's co-owned by Marvel and DC called Access, who kind of bridges the two worlds, and they all work together to, instead of one of the universes being destroyed, the story is they all get merged into one universe, which is what leads into Amalgam Comics.
Who owns Access now?
It's co-owned by Marvel and DC, which is why you don't see the character very often.
But neither of them have the rights to access live action.
I think they all cross the board share. So if he were to show up in live action, it would have to be a joint project with Marvel and DC, which I would argue is not likely to happen.
Huh.
And to that point, so that wasn't the only thing that was talked about. It was an idea was floated that at the end of the event, Marvel and DC would trade a character. They would each give a character to the other. Roxy almost spit her coffee out.
That's
When heard that.
crazy. It's tea, and that was the tea.
That was the tea. Levitt said, I don't know that the idea lasted more than one meeting with me or someone just throwing up on the table and saying, oh God, that is so much more work than it could possibly be worth. I think the idea was characters that we wouldn't necessarily miss, but could potentially make more valuable by generating new interest in another universe. Mars recalled, quote, the characters discussed were She-Hulk and Martian Manhunter. I felt like those were great picks because at least in terms of power sets, they're kind of redundant characters. She-Hulk is, well, a Lady Hulk, and Martian Manhunter is pretty close to Superman, just green with a big brow. They both would have seemed more original in the opposite universe. Again, from what I remember, the idea was a 1-year term, at which point the characters go back.
That's so cool. 1 year, that would be perfect.
Yep.
If it's only 1 year, you guys should have swapped fucking Spider-Man and Batman and called it a day.
There's no way DC and Marvel would give up Superman or Spider-Man and Batman. No way.
For 1 year, it would have been so sick.
It would have been sick. There's no way they would do it. But after the year, at which point the characters go back to their home universes, possibly to be replaced by another swap of characters. Yeah, so that didn't happen. The editorial boards were like, no way. We're not doing that. That was floated. But what they did do is they merged the two universes into a slate of what ended up being 24 one-shots called Amalgam Comics. And that's what we're going to talk about next. But this was the story of Marvel versus DC, or DC versus Marvel, depending which issues you pick up. Roxy, are you bummed you missed this? You don't need to tell how old you were in 96, but are you bummed you weren't picking this up in 96?
I was 5,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of going to say I bet it was in my household.
Yeah. It was somewhere in there. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if you even know this, but my dad was a massive comic book collector. My brother is going through and selling a lot of them right now. I mean, we have like maybe 10,000 comics in the attic. Crazy amounts. And my brother was a huge comic book reader.
Yeah.
So sometimes I caught a couple of things.
Yeah, you should see if you have these copies floating around somewhere. I mean, you might have already sold them off.
He might have. He's
Yeah.
selling everything, which like it kind of makes my heart sad, but also that shit is worth so much money.
Yeah, it's worth so much money and also space. Like I got this big file. This is where I got
Yeah.
these. I got a big filing cabinet with my comics, and once I got the filing cabinet, I'm like, this is it. This is I have to get rid of. If I run out of space, I have to get rid of stuff to make more space because I can't. This is as big as it gets.
Yeah, totally.
So that's the story of DC versus Marvel. Next up is Amalgam.